The city did not breathe, it fermented. In the year of our Lord, 1348, the stone walls of Oakhaven, or whatever name the cartographers chose to forget, did not merely contain people, they gripped them. To a traveler approaching from the windward meadows, the city was first a smudge on the horizon, then a silhouette of spires, and finally, a physical blow to the senses. It was a wall of scent so thick it felt like wool in the throat. It was the smell of a god who had turned his back on his creation to let it ripen in the sun. Brother Thomas sat in the scriptorium of the Grey Friars, his quill poised over a vellum sheet that seemed to sweat in the humidity. He was a man whose nose had long since surrendered. To live within these walls was to undergo a slow cauterization of the spirit. He watched a single fly, fat and iridescent with the spoils of the gutter, crawl across the inkwell. The air, Thomas wrote, his hand steady despite the low thrum of the bells signaling yet another passing, is the medium of our exile. We are born in the scent of milk and hay, but we die in the reek of our own persistence. Why did the cities of men stink with such a violent, unyielding hunger? The historian, looking back through the flickering candle flame of centuries, might speak of the lack of sewers, the density of livestock, or the tanneries that soaked hides in urine and dog feces. The physical reality was far more intimate. The stench was the sound of time rotting. In the Middle Ages, time was not a digital tick, it was the slow liquefaction of organic matter. It was the cabbage leaf turning to slime in the kennel, it was the horse dung steaming in the rain, it was the overflow of the cesspits that sat like stagnant black hearts beneath every tenement. Thomas looked out of the narrow window. Below him, the street, a vein of mud and discarded history, was narrow enough for two neighbors to touch hands across the void. There was no movement of air here. The wind, which carried the scent of lavender and pine from the distant hills, broke its teeth against the battlements and never descended into the canyons of the poor. He thought of the miasma. The physician spoke of it as a sentient fog, a corrupt vapor that carried the seeds of the pestilence. They believed that to smell the decay was to invite the demon in. And yet, how could one not? To cease breathing was to die, to breathe was to be infected by the very essence of the city's crowded soul. There was a philosophy to this filth, though a bitter one. In the isolation of the city walls, under the pressure of the king's taxes and the church's iron morality, the smell was the only thing that was truly shared. The bishop in his velvet robes, scented with expensive ambergris and cloves, could not entirely escape the waft of the slaughterhouse 2 streets away. The stench was a great leveler. It reminded the proud that their bodies were composed of the same failing clay as the beggars. It was the constant, olfactory reminder of the memento mori. We huddled together for warmth and safety, Thomas mused, the scent of parched parchment mixing with the heavy, metallic odor of the nearby ironworks, and in doing so, we create a climate of our own corruption. Is freedom found only in the lonely, scentless heights of the mountains? And if so, why do we crave this suffocating hive? He remembered a girl he had seen that morning, a water carrier. Her feet were bare, stained the color of old mahogany by the filth of the cobbles. She carried a yoke with 2 buckets, her face set in a mask of grim endurance. As she passed a particularly stagnant heap of offal, she did not flinch. She had integrated the reek into her identity. To her, the smell of the city was the smell of home. It was the smell of survival. The sensory landscape was a dense thicket. There was the sharp, acidic bite of the dyer's vats, where wood and alum fought for dominance. There was the heavy, cloying sweetness of the bakeries, which, instead of offering relief, seemed to provide a terrifying contrast to the sour rot of the gutters. There was the smell of unwashed wool, heavy with the grease of the sheep and the sweat of the weaver. And beneath it all, the omnipresent, earthy groan of the soil, saturated with generations of waste, unable to swallow any more. In this isolation, the inhabitants grew inward. The pressure of the walls and the weight of the air created a psychological density. People spoke in hushed tones, as if loud noises might disturb the heavy vapors and cause them to settle more thickly. They moved with a peculiar, rhythmic gait to avoid splashing the night soil that ran in the central channel of the street. The smell was a wall. It kept the world out and the fear in. It was the smell of a society that had mastered the soul but forgotten the skin. Thomas dipped his quill again. The candle flickered, casting a long, dancing shadow of a cross against the stone. Faith, he wrote, is the only fragrance that does not fail in Oakhaven. We pray because the air is too heavy to carry our sighs. We look to the heavens not for the stars, but for the hope of a breeze that has never touched a human lung. He closed his eyes and tried to imagine the smell of the first day of creation. It must have been the scent of wet stone and light. But here, in the heart of the 14th century, light had a smell, and it smelled of burning tallow and damp despair. The silence of the scriptorium was broken by a distant cry. Someone had found a mark on their skin. The miasma had claimed another. Thomas did not move. He simply breathed, shallow, careful breaths, accepting the city into himself, one atom of decay at a time. He was a historian of the invisible, a chronicler of the air that everyone felt but no one dared to name. As the sun began to set, turning the city's haze into a bruised purple, the smell seemed to intensify, rising from the ground like a ghost. It was the hour when the earth exhaled. And in that exhalation, one could hear the collective heartbeat of thousands of souls, trapped in a beautiful, terrible, and stinking cage of their own making. This was the first lesson of the city: to live was to be stained. To be pure was to be absent. And as the bells began to toll for the evening vespers, the scent of incense rose from the chapel below, a thin, spicy defiance against the overwhelming tide of the world's rot. It was a beautiful smell, but it was also a lie. The truth was in the gutter, and the gutter was overflowing. If the city was a beast that fermented, then Elian was the one who stirred the vat. He lived at the edge of the river Fleet, a waterway that had long since ceased to be water and had become a slow-moving sludge of industrial sin. Elian was a tanner. In the hierarchy of the senses, he occupied the lowest circle of hell. His hands were permanently stained a deep, bruised violet from the bark liquors, and his skin carried a scent so pungent that even the city's stray dogs avoided his shadow. To the world outside his workshop, the smell of a tannery was a violence, a mixture of stale urine, rotting flesh, and the sharp, astringent bite of oak gall. But to Elian, sitting in the damp heat of his shed, the smell was a map. He could tell the health of a beast by the way its hide reacted to the steep. He could smell the passing of the seasons in the humidity that rose from the pits. They look at us with pity, Elian thought, watching the sun struggle to pierce the thick, yellowish fog that clung to the riverbank. They hold their perfumed handkerchiefs to their faces and hurry past. But they wear my leather on their feet. They carry their Bibles in the skins I have purged of rot. They walk upon the very thing they find unbearable. This was the great paradox of the medieval world: the most essential things were often the most repulsive. To create beauty, one had to dwell in the heart of the foul. To provide the soldier with his buff coat or the lady with her soft gloves, men like Elian had to isolate themselves, becoming outcasts in the very society they clothed. He often sat by the pits during the long, suffocating twilights, reflecting on the nature of purity. The church taught that the soul was a white lily, yet every day Elian saw that life was sustained by the dark and the pungent. The fields were fertilized with waste, the finest parchments were scraped from the bellies of dead calves. Was freedom, then, merely the ability to choose which scent governed your life? We are all soaking in a pit of time, he whispered to the steaming vats. We are all being cured by the bitter salts of experience. Death is simply the moment the liquor has finally reached the center of the hide. The isolation of the tanner's quarter was not merely social, it was atmospheric. The air here was heavier than in the markets of the North Gate. It had a metallic, alkaline quality that made the back of the throat itch. It was an air that had been used and reused, stripped of its freshness by the constant demand of the chemical baths. Elian remembered a time before the pits, a childhood in the high heaths where the air smelled of nothing but cold stone and gorse. That memory felt like a dream belonging to another man. In the city, nothing was not a scent. Even the silence had a smell, the smell of damp stone and the slow growth of moss in the shadows where the sun never reached. As the evening bells of the Grey Friars echoed across the water, the same bells Brother Thomas heard in his scriptorium, Elian felt a strange sense of kinship with the monk. Thomas dealt in the spirit, and Elian in the skin, yet both were trapped in the same suffocating vessel. The monk's incense was a prayer for escape, the tanner's urine vat was a testament to the here and now. The stench was a teacher of patience. You could not rush the tanning of a hide, just as you could not rush the passing of a plague or the aging of a man. You had to wait. You had to endure the smell until it became a part of you, until you no longer noticed the boundary between your own breath and the city's exhaust. If the soul has a scent, Elian mused, wiping his stained brow with an even more stained sleeve, it is not the scent of flowers. Flowers are for the dead. The living smell of salt, of effort, and of the slow, necessary decay that precedes a new form. He looked at his hands. They were cracked and calloused, the skin thickened by years of exposure to the elements. They were the hands of a man who had made peace with the world's ugliness. In a city terrified of the miasma, Elian was a king of the corruption. He did not fear the air, he commanded it. But as the night deepened and the fires of the nearby smithies cast a hellish red glow on the river, a bitter thought entered his mind. He was free within his walls of scent because no one dared to enter them. His isolation was his sovereignty. But what was a king without a people? He was a master of bitter waters, reigning over a kingdom of discarded things, waiting for the wind to change, though it never did. The second lesson of the city was this: the things we hide are the things that hold us together. The beauty of the cathedral was built on the sweat of the quarry, the silk of the merchant was traded for the wool of the unwashed shepherd. And in the heart of the dark, where the smell was strongest, the pulse of the city beat the loudest, raw and unashamed. If Elian the tanner was the master of the city's depths, then Lady Isabella was the curator of its heights. Yet, even in her stone solar, high above the churning mud of the streets, the atmospheric pressure of the city was a physical weight. Isabella held a pomander to her nose, a delicate, silver filigree sphere filled with a mixture of cloves, dried rose petals, and costly ambergris. It was her shield, her tiny, portable fortress against the world. To her, the city was not a place of stone and people, but a sea of invisible tides. She navigated Oakhaven by moving from one island of scent to another, the spiced air of the chapel, the cedar-heavy library, the herb garden where rosemary and lavender fought a losing battle against the rising damp. We live in a state of siege, she thought, her eyes tracking the thin line of gray smoke rising from a chimney across the square. The walls keep the enemies out, but they keep the rot in. We are marinating in our own history. In the high halls of the nobility, the stench was treated as a moral failing of the air itself. They burned expensive resins and scattered fresh rushes on the floors to hide the smell of the damp earth beneath. But this created a new, more complex sensory layer, a cloying, heavy sweetness that felt like a funeral shroud. It was the scent of denial. Isabella often wondered about the nature of truth. If the tanner's pit was the reality of the body, was her pomander a lie? Or was it a necessary grace, a way to maintain the dignity of the soul when the flesh was surrounded by decay? She felt a profound isolation, not of distance, but of essence. She was separated from the common folk by a barrier of perfume, yet they all breathed the same molecules of the dying year. Is wealth merely the ability to breathe a different air, she mused, the silver of the pomander cold against her palm? And if so, what happens when the wind dies down? We are all breathing each other's lives. The baker's breath becomes the priest's prayer, and the beggar's cough becomes the king's dream. The city's stench was a constant reminder of the fragility of order. No matter how many laws the council passed about the disposal of waste, the air remained lawless. It carried the truth of the slums into the bedchambers of the palace. It was a silent messenger of the inevitable. Isabella remembered her father speaking of the great silence during the frost of 20 winters ago, when the smells were frozen into the ground. It was the only time she felt truly free, when the world was crisp, sharp, and odorless. But as soon as the thaw came, the city wept its stored-up corruption, and the burden returned, heavier than before. Time, in these gilded rooms, felt stagnant. Without the movement of fresh air, thoughts seemed to circle and settle like dust. She felt the pressure of the walls, the weight of her heavy brocade gowns, and the suffocating intimacy of a city that never allowed its inhabitants a moment of true, scentless solitude. We seek God in the clouds because we hope the air is thinner there, Isabella wrote in her private journal, her script elegant and cramped. We build our spires higher and higher, not to reach the stars, but to escape the breath of the street. But the higher we go, the more we realize that we are just birds in a larger cage, waiting for a wind that never comes. She looked down at the square. A group of children were playing near a stagnant fountain, their laughter ringing out in the heavy air. They didn't seem to notice the reek. To them, it was simply the smell of the world. Isabella felt a sudden, sharp pang of envy for their ignorance. They were at home in the fermentation, she was a stranger in a land she was born to rule. The third lesson of the city was a cold one: even the most beautiful mask cannot stop the air from reaching the lungs. In the democracy of the senses, there are no crowns. Only the long, slow inhalation of a world that is slowly turning to dust, and the quiet hope that, somewhere beyond the walls, there is a place where the wind smells of nothing at all. The scent of Oakhaven was not a single note, it was a symphony of survival, and its most dedicated audience were those who had never known anything else. To the children of the Rookery, the tangled maze of wood and plaster that leaned precariously over the northern docks, the air was not an enemy. It was the medium of their play, the very fabric of their reality. Young Tomas, no more than 10 winters old, sat atop a pile of discarded timber near the main market square. His world was defined by a sensory map that would have driven Lady Isabella to madness. To Tomas, the smell of the city was a guide. The sharp, acidic tang of the fishmonger's stalls meant the day was half spent. The heavy, metallic scent of the blacksmith's forge signaled the warmth of a nearby fire. And the thick, cloying odor of the communal ovens was the smell of a hunger that might, for once, be satisfied. He watched the adults move through the streets with their strained faces and hurried steps. He saw the way the fine folk held their scented silks to their noses, their eyes darting with a frantic desire to be elsewhere. Tomas found this curious. To him, to flee the scent was to flee life itself. Why do they run, he wondered, swinging his legs over the edge of the timber. The smell is just the city telling us it's alive. It's the smell of everyone doing something. If it didn't smell, would we even be here? This was the raw, unpolished philosophy of the gutter. In the absence of gardens and open fields, the children of the Middle Ages found beauty in the textures of decay. They played with marbles made of rounded river stones slick with algae, they raced boats made of bark down the channels of gray water that carved canyons through the mud. To them, the miasma was not a carrier of death, but the breath of the stone beast they called home. But even for a child, the weight of the air had a way of settling in the bones. As the afternoon sun began to bake the narrow alleys, the humidity rose, carrying with it the scent of 1,000 unwashed lives trapped in a space meant for 100. It was a smell that spoke of the impossible density of human existence. It was the smell of lack of space, lack of water, lack of a horizon. Tomas closed his eyes and tried to imagine freedom. In the stories the friars told, heaven was a place of endless light and the scent of lilies. But Tomas couldn't picture a lily. In his mind, heaven was a place where the air was as clear as a glass of spring water, where you could breathe all the way down to your toes without feeling the tickle of soot or the heaviness of the butcher's yard. Is the soul like the air? He whispered to the shadows. Does it get dirty if it stays in the city too long? Or is it like the river, always moving, even if the top is covered in scum? The isolation of the poor was a physical thing, built of narrow walls and low ceilings. In the tenements, families lived packed together like herrings in a barrel. The air there was a communal possession, shared between grandmother and infant, sick and healthy. It was a thick, humid atmosphere that tasted of cabbage soup and damp wool. There was no privacy in such an air, every secret was exhaled into the common room. The sounds of the city were muffled by this density. The ringing of the bells felt blunt, the shouts of the carters sounded distant, as if the air itself were trying to drown out the noise of man's ambition. It was a quiet, suffocating world where the only thing that truly moved was the rot. And yet, there was a strange, haunting beauty in the way the light filtered through the haze. At a certain hour, when the sun was low, the dust motes danced in shafts of gold that looked like the ladders of angels. In those moments, the stench seemed to transform. It became a golden vapor, a shimmering proof of the city's vitality. For a few minutes, Tomas wasn't a beggar on a woodpile, he was a prince of the dust, reigning over a kingdom of light and shadow. But the light always faded, and the gold turned back to gray. The smell would sharpen again, regaining its bite as the night fires were lit. We are like the moss, Tomas thought, rubbing a patch of green velvet on the damp wood. We grow where it's dark and wet because that's where we belong. The people with the perfumes, they're like the flowers. They need the sun, and they wilt when it gets too heavy. But we just keep growing. The fourth lesson of the city was one of endurance, to be born into the reek is to be forged by it. While the high-born sought to escape the air, the low-born learned to inhabit it. They found the gaps in the stench where a human could breathe, they found the rhythm of the decay that allowed them to survive another day. It was a bitter inheritance, a legacy of filth and fear, but it was also a testament to the stubborn, unyielding nature of the human spirit. As Tomas climbed down from his perch, his hands stained with the grime of the city, he took a deep, defiant breath. It tasted of smoke, of old stone, and of the tireless effort of 10,000 souls. It was the taste of Oakhaven, and for now, it was enough. Beyond the tanners' pits, the nobles' solars, and the children's timber piles, there stood the heart of Oakhaven, the Cathedral. It was a mountain of lacework stone, reaching toward a sky it could never quite touch. Here, the atmosphere of the city underwent its final, most complex transformation. Inside the great nave, the smell of the world was filtered through the heavy, ancient scent of cold incense and beeswax. It was a fragrance that didn't just exist in the air, it lived in the very pores of the stone. To the weary pilgrim, the air of the cathedral was a sanctuary, a cool, silent rebuke to the chaotic reek of the marketplace. But for Brother Thomas, who spent his nights here in prayer, the scent of the church was something deeper. It was the smell of eternity trying to make peace with the temporary. "We burn the myrrh to invite the angels," Thomas whispered, his voice lost in the vast, echoing heights of the vaulted ceiling. But even the smoke of the altar must eventually settle as soot upon the floor. There is no escaping the weight of the material world, even in the house of God. The silence of the cathedral was not empty, it was heavy with the breath of centuries. The air here was still, a stagnant pool of history that tasted of damp earth and old iron. It was the scent of time itself, moving so slowly that it felt like a solid object. In this isolation, the monks and the faithful sought a different kind of freedom, not the freedom of the open hills, but the freedom of the spirit, detached from the demands of the flesh. But even here, the city would not be ignored. On humid days, the scent of the overflowing gutters would seep through the heavy oak doors, curling around the marble pillars like a ghost. It was a reminder that the soul cannot exist without the body, and the body belongs to the earth. The miasma and the incense were two halves of a single truth, that life is a process of constant, fragrant change. Thomas often sat by the tomb of a forgotten knight, the stone effigy worn smooth by the hands of the grieving. He reflected on the nature of memory. If a city's identity was tied to its scent, what happened when the city died? Would the smell of Oakhaven linger in the soil for 1,000 years, a phantom reek of ambition and toil? Or would it vanish like a candle flame, leaving only the cold, scentless wind? "We are all breaths in the dark," he wrote in his mind, having left his quill in the scriptorium. A single inhalation of grace, a long exhalation of labor, and then, the silence. Does God judge us by the purity of our air, or by the courage with which we breathe the foulness we are given? The fifth lesson of the city was a spiritual one, the sacred and the profane are made of the same atoms. The incense that rose toward the heavens and the rot that sank into the mud were part of a single cycle. To love the world was to love its entirety, the rose and the refuse, the light and the shadow. In the flickering light of the votive candles, the cathedral seemed to breathe. The shadows moved with the rhythm of a giant's lungs, and the air grew thick with the presence of the unseen. It was a moment of profound, terrifying intimacy. In the heart of the reek, Thomas felt a sudden, sharp clarity. The smell was not a curse, it was a connection. It was the physical proof that no one in Oakhaven was truly alone. They were all bound together by the very air they shared, a common destiny written in the language of the senses. As the midnight bells began to toll, their heavy, bronze notes cutting through the stagnant air, Thomas bowed his head. He no longer sought to escape the scent. He accepted it as a part of his penance, a part of his prayer. The city was a forge, and the air was the fire. And in that fire, something was being shaped, something that smelled of smoke and effort, but also of hope. The night was long, and the air was heavy, but the cathedral stood firm, a beacon of stone in a sea of shifting vapors. And for a moment, the scent of Oakhaven felt like the scent of a long, difficult journey toward a home that was still, for now, just out of reach. The year turned, as it always did, with a slow and grinding indifference. The winter of 1348 arrived not with a cleansing frost, but with a damp, clinging mist that seemed to trap the city's breath within its own stone lungs. Oakhaven, exhausted by its own persistence, began to settle into the quietude of a long, final night. For Brother Thomas, the scribe who had chronicled the air, for Elian, the tanner who had mastered the bitter waters, for Lady Isabella, who had hidden behind a silver mask, and for young Tomas, the prince of the dust, the story of the city scent was reaching its bitter, beautiful conclusion. The question had always been, why? Why did the cities of men, the pinnacles of his ambition, smell of such profound and unyielding decay? The answer was not found in the lack of sewers or the overflow of the streets. Those were merely the symptoms. The truth was far more intimate. The stench was the physical weight of human proximity. It was the price paid for the desire not to be alone. In the isolation of the Dark Ages, the city was a vessel where souls were poured together, and the smell was the evidence of their blending. It was the sound of humanity, stripped of its pretenses, breathing in unison. Thomas sat at his desk one last time, the candle stub flickering in the heavy air. His lungs felt thick, as if the city had finally decided to take up permanent residence within him. "We are like the stars," he wrote, his hand trembling slightly. "Each of us burns with a tiny, individual light, but we are surrounded by a vast, cold darkness. To survive, we huddle together, and in that huddling, we create a heat that consumes us. The smell of the city is the smell of that burning. It is the scent of life, crowded and desperate, refusing to be extinguished." He thought of Isabella, whose pomanders could not keep out the truth of the world. He thought of Elian, whose stained hands were a testament to the labor that sustained the proud. He thought of the children, who played in the mud because it was the only earth they knew. All of them were bound by a single, invisible thread, the shared air of Oakhaven. The stench was a teacher of humility. It taught that no wall is high enough to separate a man from his neighbor's suffering. It taught that time does not move in a straight line, but in a circle of fermentation and rebirth. It taught that freedom is not the absence of the world's weight, but the grace with which one carries it. As the final bells began to ring, not for vespers, nor for a passing, but for the turn of the hour, Thomas looked out his window. The city was a silhouette of jagged towers against a bruised, purple sky. The smell was there, as strong as ever, rising from the earth like a prayer of the soil. It was the scent of survival. In the end, the history of the medieval city was not a history of stone or of kings. It was a history of the breath. It was the story of how a people learned to love a world that was often unbearable. The smell was the grit in the oyster, it was the friction that created the pearl of human empathy. "We die in the reek," Thomas concluded, his ink blurring as the candle died, "but we live in the effort of it. And perhaps, when we finally reach the scentless heights of the heavens, we will find ourselves longing for the heavy, spicy, and honest air of the world we left behind. For only in the dark, and only in the thick of the struggle, can a soul truly know that it has been alive." The city did not change. The gutters still overflowed, the tanneries still steamed, and the noble solars still smelled of stale roses. But the people, they were different. They carried the city within them, a bitter and beautiful secret. And as the mist finally cleared, revealing a single, cold star above the spires, Oakhaven exhaled one last time, a long sigh of weariness and hope that drifted away on the midnight wind, leaving behind nothing but the silence of the stones. The alchemy was complete. The lead of the gutter had been turned, not into gold, but into something far more precious, a memory of what it means to be human in a world that refuses to be clean. Like and subscribe to this channel for more interesting stories.